I guess that means we're going. Okay, we're going. Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure who was going to come to a panel with business in the title, and I'm glad that you all did, because I think actually this might reflect some of the topic that we're going to discuss up here. I'm Aron Pilhofer. I'm a professor of journalism at Temple University, and formerly at The Guardian, where I spent a year as the interim chief digital officer, which was a kind of incredible experience. Prior to that, I ran basically visual journalism at The Guardian. Prior to that, I was at the New York Times for 9 years, where I had a dual report to the chief technology officer and the managing editor, running basically a product technology team in the newsroom. My background is journalism, and I spent an awful lot of time dealing with the business side. And that's the inspiration, really, for this panel today, is more and more of us, more journalists, are being asked to participate in the business side of the operation, whether it's through membership, whether it's through subscriptions, whether you're being asked to pay more attention to metrics, whether you're being, whether words like funnel come up in normal conversation on a regular basis. Those of you who are laughing, I know who you are, because you've heard that term more than once. And I want to make this panel really utility-oriented today. So we're going to talk about some of our experiences. Everybody on this panel has been an editor, a senior editor at one point, and has moved to the business side, or has had responsibilities that transcend both sides, and have a lot of experience dealing with that. And so we're going to talk a little bit about our own experiences. We're going to offer some tips. I'm going to be taking some notes. And at the end of this panel, I will tweet out a sort of a document that will accompany the panel that you can take with you, and maybe it'll help you, maybe it won't. But I like the idea of having some sort of an artifact. I can remember the first time I attended my new co-boss's staff meeting. This is Mark Franz. He was then the chief technology officer of the New York Times. And I had just moved into a role reporting both to him and to the managing editor. And I went to our first staff meeting, which all technologists, all tech managers. And the most extraordinary thing happened. Everyone came in with a laptop. The minute the meeting started, everybody's laptop flipped open, and the entire room was doing this. Nobody was paying any attention to what Mark Franz, the chief technology officer of the New York Times, was saying. And I went to more meetings like that all the time. And I realized very quickly, this is a very different world. There's a very different culture. There's a very different way of doing things. And over a period of about 9 years, I got to see a lot of the organization on the technology side and the ad side, both. And so, and then at The Guardian, I had the opportunity to actually sit on the executive committee, which was terrifying, to be quite honest, especially when you're faced with cutting 20% of your staff the first week that you're in that job. So with that, I'd love to just sort of go down the table. Maybe Janine, oh, actually, let me introduce the people. Oh my God. So to my left, so embarrassing. Sorry, I've never done this before. To my left, of course, Janine Gibson, my former boss, has the distinction of having hired two people on this panel, myself and Amanda, down at the end.
Freelanced.
Oh, yeah.
Did you really? Well, there you go. Okay, there you go. 3 of the panelists here. Former editor-in-chief of BuzzFeed UK, former editor-in-chief of The Guardian US, famously ran the Snowden coverage, hired Glenn Greenwald, which led to all of that, played by Jolie Richardson in the film version, deputy editor of The Guardian, and at one point ran all digital content for The Guardian, and had more than a little to do with the business side. To Janine's left is Jeff Jarvis, professor of journalism at CUNY.
Newmark Graduate School of Journalism.
Sorry, Newmark Graduate School. Everybody's got to be on brand. Author, writer, talking about innovationer. At one time, Jeff actually had a real job. at the New York Daily News. He actually wrote the original pitch that became Entertainment Weekly, was the managing editor there, and he was president of Advance Internet. So Jeff has had a lot of experience dealing with P&Ls and other businessy nonsense. Amanda Mikkel is at the very end. She's Global Director and Senior Product Manager for Contributions at The Guardian in London. Her background is she has probably the most interesting background for a journalist that I know of. Began as a political organizer for the Dean and Kerry campaigns, launched and ran Off the Bus, which you might remember from 2008, which was one of the earliest and probably easily one of the most successful experiments in citizen journalism we've ever had. She was open editor at The Guardian US, where Janine hired her, and then came with me to the United Kingdom, where she is the only journalist I know that also has revenue responsibilities. So that is the panel
God,
today.
she does.
Yeah.
Because The Guardian is going to break even soon because she does.
Yeah. So let's just go down the table. First of all, I'd love for each of you to just talk about some of what you learned coming into dealing with sort of the business side of the operation. What was your first experience with it? How did you learn to interact, and what kind of advice would you give people in the audience here?
So we tend to think of this as a very modern question, and one that has been provoked by digital and the different sorts of business models that we're all dealing with now, and the complexity of the business models we're all dealing with now. But I started out as a trade journalist, working on B2B publications, where you are incredibly close to the people you write about, who also advertise with you, who are the they're just the entire ecosystem around your publication, and feel it's much closer to the digital publishing relationship, I think, that we have now, where everybody is customer, client, subject, scoop, whatever. And similarly, when I started at The Guardian, we had a lot of sections that were to generate classified ad revenue and take display advertising revenue as well. They were the early experiments on the internet. We did a lot of our vertical websites out of those revenue bases. And it meant, again, you are operating in a fairly small ecosystem of the people you write about, the people that advertise with you, the people that you're getting your revenue from. You know them very, very deeply. And we always understood, I think, in those verticals, the value of the data. And the journalists knew fine well that they would get more done if they worked with the commercial team than perhaps the more prominent sections on the newspaper or the main website. That those vertical sections, and back in the 90s when I was editing them, they were generating £90 million in revenue a year. And The Guardian still lost money. We managed to spend all of it. They were obviously insanely important to the commercial teams. Everybody's bonus depended on those. So if you wanted to launch a website, you'd go and talk to the commercial teams, not the editor of the paper. And we had publishers first. We had publishers who were devoted to sections. And we understood, we had to learn a language that went, what is a tent pole, or what sort of conferences should we do, or what is our book, or what is our ancillary products. That I think just at that point, if you worked in news or in features, you probably didn't have those conversations at that time. And I think what I learned from that was not to view the commercial team as something that happens on another floor where somebody picks up the phone and sells some ads, that these are your partners in understanding your audience. The first piece of data I ever saw about my audience came from them. They commissioned it. They told me what people did, what the job titles of the readership were, and where they were in the organisation. And of course, they find that a good commercial team will always find the journalist the most useful source of intel on what their market can take. When Rupert Murdoch launched Sky in the UK, he famously did a whole bunch of market research about how much skyboxes should cost, how much should a subscription cost, and they got every possible range of number. And then he phoned up Kelvin Mackenzie, who was the editor of The Sun, and said, what will your readers pay for a Sky subscription then? And he went, 50 quid? It was 50 quid. Because Kelvin knew 4 million Sun readers better than any market research person could tell him the answer to that question. Anyway, so to cut a long story short, because I appear to have gone back to the 80s, my experience of working with the business teams has been extrapolated entirely from that, which is this doesn't have to be an adversarial relationship. You quite often have to say no, but it's coming from a place where you can both learn something about your readers, your audience, and how to make your product better from the same motivation.
Yeah, great. Jeff?
So, as Aron was nice enough to give me credit for, I started the magazine Entertainment Weekly in the United States. And it was my idea, and I wrote the memo, and it took, I think, 6 years from memo to launch because Time Inc. was ruled by task forces that tried to kill ideas. The first memo back said that one magazine could not possibly serve everyone who in entertainment because people who watch television do not read.
Wow.
So it finally started. I'll spare you the long stories. It requires many beers. But the business side fucked me over and didn't tell me that they had raised the circulation limit for the magazine. They didn't tell me they'd put the magazine on expensive positions in supermarkets. I was doing what I thought was a subscription magazine at a high level, and the first returns of the magazine from the newsstands were legendary. And much panic ensued. It turns out that the bosses had dreamt of having People Magazine Junior. This was started because it wasn't People Magazine, because that was a change in time and we had more choice and there was a consumer need for something about the product, not the personality. Long story and long career short, I walked out in a huff one fateful Friday and quit. And I vowed that I would never be in a position again where I didn't know the business, because I couldn't protect my baby. There were moments when the top editors at Time Inc. would call my staff with me to what we called, to lunch meetings we called Shea Woodshed, where they would beat us up for being too mean to entertainment at the same time the company was merging with Warner Brothers. And so it was an unpleasant experience, but I learned a lot. But I also learned what I needed to learn. I had to learn the business of journalism. I went to the Daily News in New York, which was about to go on strike. My departure from EW had been pretty public. A wag on the city desk said, "Man, you just went from the frying pan to the microwave." We went through a horribly ugly strike. We were bought by Robert Maxwell, a robber baron from British press. It speaks very ill of my character that we got along. He made me associate publisher. He did all kinds of other ridiculous things, but I learned the business. I started all kinds of new sections there. I then went to TV Guide, where I also started a magazine Test, and my boss there at first yelled at me and said, "You shouldn't be paying attention to the business side. You're an editor. Stop doing that." She later became a business executive there, and I learned more about the business. And then I went to Advanced Publications, the Newhouses, Condé Nast, where I started all of our local sites and helped start our national sites. And there I really learned the business. And Steve Newhouse, one of the owners, taught me the hard way. And I learned how to negotiate, and I learned how to read P&Ls, and I learned how to understand where our value was. And I learned how to be strategic and learned how to negotiate. So then after 12 years of that, I left to come to CUNY, City University of New York, and what is now, I'm proud to say, the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism. And I vowed that I was going to teach journalists the business of journalism, because without that, we are poor stewards. Just as I couldn't protect my baby, Entertainment Weekly, from Shea Woodshed, I needed to be able to protect what we do. But I also needed to be tough on myself and make smarter decisions, strategic decisions about the business. So we'll go through the various details that Aron will outline of kind of the specifics of that. But Janine mentions it's the language, it's the negotiation with the business side, it's understanding what strategy is, where are we headed, it's understanding where the value is, it's being able to read PowerPoints and spreadsheets and being able to hold your own in that business meeting, because you do know what strategy is, you do know where you're headed, and yes, they may know more about how to do a sales pitch to a given advertiser, and they may know more about the data of subscriber acquisition cost, but goddamn it, I knew what it was too, and I could have that debate with them. Now, I only wish I'd known it decades before.
Yeah, Amanda.
So a long time ago, I was hired by both Jay Rosen and Ariana Huffington to direct Off the Bus. And it was an experimental project and funded through a grant, as well as a very wealthy individual. And I hadn't really paid much attention to that fact until, flash forward about 6 months in, the chief financial officer for Huffington Post came to let me know there wasn't any money left in my account to pay me, and that I really needed to turn in the next part of the grant application. And I, in that moment, realized there had been something in my inbox that I hadn't really paid much attention to because I'd been really busy, and this had been far from, what I'd really thought as being
when you interviewed at the Guardian.
part of my job. And the questions that were asked weren't necessarily the questions I'd been asking myself those few months. And I worked through the application, and over the course of Off the Bus, realized both that A, it was a bit of a pain to fill out the applications, but B, if I did it well, we also had additional resource. And so that was my, I think, very sort of crude and rough awakening onto the business side. It was really a matter of what felt like survival at the time on many fronts.
How are you with email now?
Much better. But actually, what really made a big difference to me was actually a single comment made by my then boss at ProPublica, Dick Toffel, who, when I was working with him to think about how to make the newsroom's culture much more collaborative, said to me at one point, don't ever be judged by a metric you can't understand. And don't let someone introduce a metric against your own work unless you agree to it. And conversely, when you're introducing metrics to the newsroom, as I was, to really think through the broader implications of them and make sure you work with others. And I think just at the sort of most basic level, for me, working with the business side and frankly with product has often meant a shift in perspective, a different way of valuing and measuring the work. And it really starts, at least it did for me, with understanding those metrics, because almost everything's tied up into them, whether it's the targets that are set, what's being measured, how it's being accounted for. And so, it began with just literally the metrics and the vocabulary.
Yeah, actually, okay, so let's stay on this theme of what we learned. Let's maybe think about what would be one tip, one thing you learned that might be incredibly valuable. I'll throw out the thing that I learned very, very quickly. That journalists, at least in my experience, tend to think about the business side as this sort of black box, as a bunch of people wearing fancy shoes, driving better cars than we do, who are motivated by money, who are there to punch in, make money for the news organization and leave, and that the passion and the mission sits in the newsroom. And I can tell you that is 100% wrong, 100% wrong. When I had the privilege of running the digital development team at The Guardian, I can tell you there was as much passion, as much focus on mission, in some cases more, in that room than there was in the news floor. And a lot of times I think the newsroom doesn't know that and doesn't appreciate it. And I think this is a big problem that needs to be addressed. Maybe Janine?
It's not 100% wrong. They do often have more expensive shoes and much better tier points. So
that is true.
they fly on better on the planes. However, it is
Bitter, are we?
absolutely true. It's absolutely true that anybody who is selling news right now, who is good at selling, could be selling something else. So there's a reason why they are selling news. And it is incumbent on us to respect that and to partner with that. Nakedly commercial organisations have commercial teams who at least understand that news is a premium to what they are selling and the value of that, and are broadly, I think, very supportive of it. I think that tip about knowing the metrics is really important, especially when you are having high-level negotiations over resources allocations, which can often, and it can be product, you can be actually fighting for something that's very important journalistic to be done against something that is very important in revenue. And I always say it's like playing mahjong and Macau casino, that all these priorities are being traded at an enormous vast speed all around the table, and if you aren't aware not only what your own KPIs are but what they're talking about, then you're always going to lose.
Right.
So that is a really important point. I think probably though, if I was really doing 101 for journalists having to do business, I would say try and ignore the sums of money at stake. Because it's almost always £1 million. It's almost always £1 million is at stake here if you don't do this thing in this way. And it's never £1 million, It always comes down to, I don't know, 20 and change. And if you've given up the thing because the principal was £1 million, then we're just in that Churchill joke of, well, we've established that you're for sale, we're just haggling over how much. So always, whenever they say in Munber, just try and go, tenner. It's a tenner.
Jeff?
I guess my biggest first lesson was the cost of revenue. To really understand, for example, subscriber acquisition cost. That you can spend 3 times the revenue you get to get that revenue. You think, hey, let's just get subs, we'll sell all this money. Well, you have to spend literally 3 to 4 times that to get that money, and if somebody doesn't renew, you've lost 3/4 of that money. Same with sales, to understand the cost of sales. Why aren't they selling more? Well, what's the structure to do that? So the cost of money, in that sense, was eye-opening to me to understand the full side of the business. And if you hear discussions about paywalls and ad sales, you never hear that side talked about openly. Secondly, that leads to a better sense of negotiation, that whether you're sitting at an internal table or an external table with potential customers or partners, to know the value you have and to be able to do that. I learned a great deal from Steve Newhouse, who was my boss for 12 years at Advance, one of the family members. And he would go into meetings thinking they're going to want this. They think that's valuable. I know it's not. We want that, and that's what's valuable, and to know what goes in, which is my last lesson from Steve. He taught me early on, he said, Jeff, a meeting is not where you decide things. A meeting is where you confirm the things that have been decided, right? And if you walk into the meeting not at all prepared, not knowing what's going to happen, say, oh, we'll find out what we're going to decide today, you're going to get fucked. And beyond that, it's just a waste of time for everybody. So doing the homework beforehand, all these horrible words, socializing the idea beforehand, all that kind of stuff, just knowing where the value is, knowing where the cost is, knowing what's what is going to put you in a way stronger position for whatever you negotiate. And so the meeting rule is one that I've used ever since.
That's a great one. And to your point, it's actually astounding how infrequently you talk about both cost and revenue. You always talk about revenue, you never talk about cost. It's extraordinary.
Well, you do in Q4.
You do in Q4, right, exactly, yeah, exactly.
So in the last 3 years, I've worked in both the newsroom, in digital, which is product and engineering, as well as commercial. And I guess if I had to think about something you should know about each department, they might not see themselves. So when it comes to the newsroom, it's about time. Don't ask people in the newsroom to meet on a day of a massive breaking news story. Don't also ask them to meet when they've got important editorial meetings. And know, too, that things come up. I think for people who work in other parts of a news organization, time is something that you can control much more easily than if you're on a news desk. And I know from talking to a lot of my colleagues in digital and commercial, they know this, but they forget it all the time. And they get really frustrated and take it personally when people don't show up to meetings. They think their time is being abused, but it's not about them. It's about the story. And I think figuring out when to meet with your colleagues in the newsroom is actually one of the hardest things. And so sometimes when working with a colleague in the newsroom, maybe they're really an early riser and they put aside a little time for themselves and there's a small pocket that morning that works for them. Maybe it's later in the day. Maybe it's literally they come by when they can and you just know they're going to swing by during the day. I think this is something you really need to sort of negotiate and be really open to. And I think conversely, if you're in the newsroom and you know you're working with someone, another part of the business, just to make sure that you prioritize meeting up with that person at the same time. So then when it comes to digital, I think there they would say they feel often misunderstood or get frustrated with the newsroom when people ask them to build something really special, really big for tomorrow. And not only is the thing really special, but it's so special you will never use it ever again. It's that much. And so digital thinks about things that scale and repeat. You know, it's much like you build the house, you continue to use the house. And so I think for my colleagues in editorial, it's often thinking, okay, we have a class of interactives. What sort of, you know, what are the similarities between these interactives? Perhaps we'd have a tool we'd rather have than asking someone to build something just one time. And then I think very much what the two of you said, when it comes to commercial, it's knowing what value they put on things and how. Although I think in fairness, having worked on, like I mentioned, all three sides, I think there's one little thing that actually causes a lot of, offense. Wherever you work in a news organization, you are working in support of the journalism. So one thing I have seen many times over, and I know they don't mean it, but having colleagues in both commercial and digital refer bluntly to content. There are so many different forms of content in the world. Almost everything is a form of content. You work in journalism, and I know these things seem small, but they actually matter so tremendously. So those are my three little things.
I'm, at this point, going to open for questions. We'll just keep going. If there are questions out there, people are asking. Is this resonating, by the way, with people? Are there people in the room who are dealing with this? I can tell there's someone right here in the front who this is your daily experience. Yeah, there's a question over here.
Is there a mic? Should I run it?
Yeah, we started questions early, because that's the way we roll.
This was
I can repeat the question if you want to. Oh, it's Ariel. Hey, Ariel.
I've heard from a lot of folks that they realize this is a gap in their knowledge and they want to start to understand it, but it's really hard to approach the business team and sort of ask them to give them a primer. So what are your recommendations for somebody who's working on the editorial side or maybe the audience development side and wants the sort of numbers and business knowledge to bolster their case to the other departments? Like, where can they get that knowledge if not within their own newsroom? And maybe it's not even in the industry. Is it like business school classes that they might be able to take or something like that?
Seems like an Amanda question, right? Yeah.
I think the simplest thing would be just asking someone on the commercial side if they're up for grabbing a coffee and telling them you'd like to better learn what's happening. I think most people would be really open to that. Or asking, your immediate colleagues and perhaps inviting someone from commercial to do like a quick talk over lunch and walk people through things. I really think it can be that simple. And to be honest with you, I think it's much better to do it one-on-one because the jargon can be so difficult to cut through. You really need someone who will feel comfortable when you say, what does that mean? And then again, what does that mean? And again, what does that mean? So I would really just reach out to someone. When I first began working with commercial, I attended a lot of meetings that, frankly, required immediate translation and later translation, and so I would just go one-on-one.
Jeff, you had.
Well, pardon me, I'm going to plug a program at Newmark. Nita Zelina, who was here earlier in the conference, some of you may have seen, is starting a new program in news innovation and leadership. And for us as a school, same with Aron and Temple, diversity matters greatly. I think we've got to attack diversity at the staff level, at the leadership level, at the ownership level. So this is the leadership level. So and I hated seeing journalists go off and get MBAs because it's just generic and it wasn't tied to our own business. So we're starting a degree program, 4 weeks in residence, over a year, to do that. Now, plug over, if you don't come to Newark, that's okay, I'll forgive you. But I agree on the one-on-ones. And the other thing that, I watched my son, who's a developer, when he needs to suddenly learn Ruby on Rails, he doesn't go to a class for Ruby, he just looks shit up. And so there's a lot you can just look up in terms of the jargon and how things operate. I will admit that I stubbornly tried to go years before I looked up what KPI stood for.
Yeah.
I didn't want to know. But you can look up a lot of that stuff. How does, what's a CPM? What's a CPC? These are stuff that you can look up and decode and figure out the dynamics. Another handy way is to find somebody who's not in your company, but you like, who's in another company, and you buy them drinks and say, okay, I'm stupid, explain this stuff. I'm not stupid, I'm ignorant. Explain this stuff to me, and find an ally that way.
And there's a third thing which I think is a bit newer, which is in my last 3 jobs, I have been overwhelmed by commercial demands for editorial help with different projects because it is such a complicated ecology now that our businesses are so diverse. There's so many different things going on, and somebody's trying to design a product to sell, somebody's trying to design an event, somebody's trying to design a theme week, somebody's trying to do an affiliate publishing program, and with Amazon or whoever. And for each one of those, I need to find an editorial partner within the team to work with the commercial team to do it. A lot of the time, there's a top editor somewhere sitting there going, oh, Christ, I've got to go to a meeting with that thing about that gardening product. And actually, if a journalist had shown interest and said to me, I would like to work more with commercial, I would have bitten their arm off and said, please go and do that. And actually, that's working on a project because they changed. Who knew 5 years ago that we'd all be doing deals with Amazon? So, those are great ways.
Here's one really pragmatic thing that I find incredibly useful, and this is embarrassing, but I'm not the only one. Digiday does a series called What the Fuck? I'm serious. And I first discovered it when my first week as interim chief digital officer, one of the ad sales people came in and started screaming about header bidding. Why are we not doing header bidding? And this person went on for about 5 minutes, and I said, I just have to stop you right now. What is header bidding? Anybody here know? Who knows what header bidding is? There you go. One person. Oh, it's Jasper in the back. Yeah, of course. Okay. Digiday, actually, those what the fucks are actually pretty useful. There are, as Jeff said, there are things you can use. One other thing that I've been talking about, Jeff and I've been talking about, and I think we're going to really do it, is we're going to start developing some courses online, distance learning and in person, to help journalists understand more about the business. It seems like it's a real need. Do we think this is a real need? Yeah. Okay. Good. Yeah. A question up here or here?
I was a student.
Hi, my name is Astrid. I'm from Germany, and I am a technology reporter. And my experience so far has been that journalists, they already educate themselves about the business, but oftentimes the salespeople, they don't educate themselves about new ways to sell things. And we had lots of meetings where they didn't even know how podcasts work, and the suggestions they made were outright ridiculous. And I don't want to blame anyone, but it's really frustrating. And do you have any tips? Because it gets so confrontational, and you go out of this meeting and you think to yourself, I can't believe this. This is his job. Why didn't he think about it? So have you made such experiences? Do you have any tips how to bring everyone on the same boat and not to make it confrontational?
This feels like we should go get coffee, because I have been in those meetings, usually about podcasts. I don't know what it is about podcasts, but I think we all love them so much. We want to do so many podcasts, and we see the value, and the journalists love them, and the audience loves them, and the reader, everybody loves them, apart from the sales team that just can't sell them. And you just, oh great, okay, yeah, no. Part of it, I think, is shifting from a mindset that goes, we have come up with this lovely product that is really great, this thing that we want to do, whether it's a supplement or a website or a podcast, whatever, or this really brilliant idea we've got for showing how people are going to vote in the next election. It's going to be so brilliant. We've come up with this idea ages in advance, and we've booked the tech time, but it's going to cost £1 million. So what we need now is for you to go out and find somebody to sponsor this for us. Could you go and sell it? And I've done that so many times, and and occasionally you get away with it. Occasionally there is somebody wandering around Samsung with £1 million, and they go, oh yeah, we'll totally do that. But actually it's really rare, and it's a lot harder now than it used to be. There was a halcyon day where somebody would wander around and go, oh yeah, totally, we'll sponsor a music website, but it doesn't really happen now. So it's a slight miscasting of the generation of the idea and the selling, that you kind of have to get together a bit earlier in the process. Now, that's not something that's easily scheduled or anticipated, so it actually comes out of closer relationships between editorial and commercial at a upstream level. That's how they would say it, upstream. Where you've both got a sort of greater understanding of, we've got a sort of like, we're thinking in this space, oh, interesting, I've got a client over here with the, and things like, you know, at BuzzFeed we would have sort of breakfast with big clients where honestly you just sort of sit around and have a chat with them about what they're doing. And it feels a bit, it's not uncomfortable, it's quite helpful. If this brand is thinking a lot about democracy and voices, that's quite helpful. If you're thinking, I'd like to do something about how people are going to vote in the next election, you're much more likely to get something out of that if you work on it together. When we were trying to do a sponsorship deal for a program on Twitter, about TV that was going to be cut up into chunks, that's quite a hard thing to take out and sell bespoke to McDonald's or Burger King. You've got to think about the kind of partner it's going to be about, and you need to work with them about how that's, because they haven't seen that thing before. That thing doesn't exist in the world. Do you see what I mean? It just, if those conversations are grinding to a halt very quickly, it might be that you're having them too late in the process.
And the sales, the time it takes to sell something is quite long.
Because they're just, yes, and and if the commercial team's job isn't really to understand the product, the commercial team's job is to understand the brief from the client, and then essentially turn around to you and go, what have you got that fits this? What have you got? What have you got from the shelf? Got something in the back?
Amanda? Yeah.
I think just as newsrooms need to keep up with the technological changes and different ways of reporting, so does the commercial side as well as the digital side. But that's a cultural shift, and sometimes it helps to have, like, every month invite in someone who's really interesting, but make sure invitations go to everyone across the organization, not just the newsroom, because I think part of it's making sure that you have a way for people across the organization to keep up with things and to make sense of them. Within contributions, I made the decision to have a cross-disciplinary team, meaning we have one team and it is composed of individuals from editorial, digital, and commercial. And we sit together, we work together. And that's been really fantastic because of all the things that we've talked about that can be problems. But interestingly, it's no longer the case that we really think along disciplinary lines. You just realize this individual is really fantastic about this. This individual is really fantastic with that. So for example, someone on my team came on with an advanced degree in math, loves to play poker, was really fantastic at thinking through some of the maths on some of our projects and really changed the way in which we thought about things. So I do think to the extent that you can, creating an ongoing collaboration. The hard thing is a lot of times collaborations fail because y'all just feel like you're stuck in a room with each other for X amount of time every week with really no immediate goal at hand. It's more like, let's collaborate. But if there's some small way of kicking it off, I find that goes a long ways. Ultimately, It comes to having one or two leaders on the commercial side who are really invested in keeping up and who set that pace for everyone else.
I'll just add something that I forget who, it might have been you, Amanda, threw into, we have a big document of bullet points, and knowing the incentives, right? Knowing what the sales team is incentivized, terrible word to do, but I'm an American, I can say it. They would love to probably go out and sell something new and exciting, but for them, they're probably facing, revenue goals that have a direct bearing on how much money they make. And it's easier to sell a big newspaper ad or you know what I mean? That's probably it. So how do you solve that? You might try to pitch some sort of a carve out where you build a team like Amanda was describing and say, this is our innovation team, and you're going to be incentivized to work with them for a period of time. Easier said than done, obviously. Other questions? Way in the back, Jess. Well, actually, there was a question right up front here. I think there was a question up here first. So we'll get to you. We'll get to you.
The journey to membership, what are the best practices that you would recommend?
As we all turn to Amanda.
I'm more than happy, by the way, to talk about that after the panel, because we can get into lots of detail. But I guess the one thing I would share that I think would be relevant to this is that the best thing that we did was sort of strip everything down to the basics. So really think about what drives support, not the additional features, the bells and whistles, and that means too how we ask readers for support. I think for a lot of organizations, you can feel easily overwhelmed because frankly, there's so much that you have to take care of and sort through, and I think it's much better to do a few things well than a lot of things not so well, and to create a sort of systematic approach that you can improve over time. But I'm more than happy to pick that up afterwards.
Yeah, Jasper, you had a question? Or we'll get you.
When we have these kind of conversations about business working with news, it seems like we have two conversations. It's either it's really brilliant that we collaborate more and it's wonderful and there's lots of new potentials and new streams and everything's fantastic, or it's sort of journalists who take a massive pride in how solidly away from business side that they ever are.
Yeah.
I've never even seen a salesperson.
Yeah.
I would rather kill one than have a conversation. That's why my journalism is brilliant and principled. How do we get a conversation that's actually somewhere in the middle of the two? Because while they're straw men, I think we hear a lot of that, and I've heard a lot of that in the last few days. How do you get a conversation that goes, you know what, this is tricky, but we have to do it?
I think that's disappearing, James. I do. I think even the areas of the newsroom where you would think you were the most insulated from the nastiness of commercial life, you aren't anymore. We all see what's happening in our industry. We all see the realities of it. There are very, very few organisations that don't have to worry in some way about how the bills are paid. In terms of each job, if you are funded entirely by foundation and or membership and or subscription, then every single journalist needs to worry about how the revenue is coming in because their work directly relates to it. And for example, Renee was talking yesterday on a similar-ish panel about Financial Times journalists being able to see how many subscribers read each of their pieces of work and what the value proposition they attach to it is, and so on. I'm sure that Amanda has similar experience of people translating, within a membership context, the value to members of each piece of content. At BuzzFeed, if you do anything that isn't news, then you're painfully aware of its commercial value. And within news, you similarly have to think very much about where on the sharing economy or the metrics that you're achieving. If you're in investigations, then you probably sold your story for film rights, and then someone's going to play you. There's sort of no hiding place, basically, increasingly. And really anybody who thinks there is not doing a service to their organisation or their readers or the future of what they're doing.
What I'm going to describe is definitely not a scene from a film, but I think it helps if the leadership I hate that expression as well, but I think it really helps if those who lead the organization are both more transparent. But by that I mean literally you could have a quarterly session in which instead of going through business metrics that most people don't understand, really just tackling some of the basic questions, which is how are we doing? How do we think we will do? And is that good enough? And in the last few years at The Guardian, we've had quarterly sessions, and I feel like that's made a real difference, both because it brings people together, it shows that it's important for everyone to have that perspective. It's also a chance to ask questions, and frankly, just continuing to do it on a regular basis means that we all get a bit better at it. We learn to understand it. So I think you just have to impart, if it's important, then make some time for it.
That's great. So I think, Jasper, you'd be the last question.
Zero in slightly more. It's a problem I currently have that I have a lot of commercial information that I could be imparting to my editorial team, but that commercial information will make them behave differently and they'll make decisions based upon that. And I'm not certain whether that's necessarily a good idea.
Right.
So my question is, are there some things your editorial team should not know about your commercial operation that you shouldn't tell them, that they should never care about, and it is in a weird way better for them to be ignorant of?
Great question.
So when I was the TV critic at TV Guide, I called Hallmark Hall of Fame movies what they were, worthless treacle. And Hallmark canceled all their ads to not TV Guide, People Magazine, People. Canceled all their ads, which you can imagine were many in People magazine. I shouldn't have known that, right? Because it was just hard for me to be able to separate that out. Now, my boss protected me the same way she did when the boss of HBO tried to get me fired because I had been critical of some HBO movies in the early days. This is long before Sopranos. And so I think that you need to protect editorial from things that with every best intention of the journalist, it would be hard to erase from their brain. Other than that kind of conflict of interest area, I firmly believe that the more every part of the operation knows, the better. And I think Amanda's point is great about the kind of all hands philosophy of the technology companies. I think that the more they understand, this is why Aron and I want to teach journalists this, so we become better stewards, so we're more empowered, so we can deal with them. So I think that I would not be too cautious about anything else.
But I think if you do share that information, you have to draw the line between what are the metrics and what are the metrics individuals are judged by. Because I think the problem happens when metrics are assigned as a reflection of someone's performance that shouldn't be, right? So I think often when you're doing lots of new things, new numbers are being produced, people are coming up with their own special ratios, their own special calculations, and before you know it, you're faced with, acronyms that you've never heard of and unsure of what that actually means for you. And I think that's a really important thing. You can say, here are the ways in which we measure X, but what does that ultimately mean or mean for you? It may not mean anything.
Can I ask you a quick question? Yeah. It goes to all of you. Just with.
Can I just say something on that though, quick? Sorry, I'm so sorry, because I wanted to say exactly the same thing. I just wanted to express it in a different way, which is
much funnier.
It's important. No. Well, I'll probably make a stupid joke, but no, it is important because I used to think that there were metrics that you couldn't show to journalists. I used to think I'd get these metrics and I can't show that to the journalists because it'll freak them out and it'll upset them and they'll stop doing this thing that's really important because they can't see how many people are ordering them. The number of people reading it isn't right. And it took me ages to realise that if the metric looks like something, if you know as an editor or as a journalist that thing is really important, that thing should be done, and the metric that you have got doesn't recognise that, then it's they're asking the wrong question. And it's very hard to assert that back again, but your instinct is right. It's your publication, you commissioned it, you knew what it was doing, it's doing the right job. It's the audience of one point. If all you can do is measure the attention and it doesn't seem to be in the right place, then it isn't the right question that's being asked and the metric is wrong.
Can I just ask you a quick question, Amanda? One newspaper I know of in the U.S. is now not giving page views as a metric, thank God, though Chris Moran would yell at me for that statement. But
yelling at you on Twitter right now.
Okay, yes. and Moran is quite right that page views themselves aren't an evil metric, but they get used in evil ways and stupid ways. But that's not the question. This newspaper now, I don't know that it goes so far as to make it a KPI for the journalists, but the pressure on the journalist is huge. Which stories lead to conversion to subscription? Mm-hmm. That does strike me as a little hinky. Do you tell journalists which stories are more likely to lead to contribution?
We are not. No, we do know that there are areas of coverage that many of our supporters value, and to some extent that has shown us ways in which we serve our readers that we hadn't fully understood. So take our coverage of the environment. That's one that we've heard from supporters that they feel incredibly loyal to and they feel strongly about, but we are not evaluating an individual journalist's work by that figure, no.
So it's all about information, but it is about the wrong metric, which I think is where we get trouble.
And I'll just cap this off. When I came to The Guardian in 2014, OFAN, which is their internal metrics tool, every journalist had it, right? Every journalist had access to that. You could see in real time what your stories were doing, what other people's stories were doing. I had just come from the New York Times where no journalist had access to that information. You know what happened is they looked up at the stars and created stories about what they saw there. They would look at things like the most emailed list, which is a completely BS metric, and that would be the thing that defined success. And so, you can make this argument many different ways. Yeah, you want to say?
Well, I was going to say, I think you can imagine like the metric of, how many people walk through, or the count of how many people walk through that door, which, is a function of how many people come into the building, which is a function of how many people come to Perugia. And like part of the problem is, you can see where this is going, is that, I think it's always be a bit wary when it's just that one single golden metric that's introduced, instead of thinking about what are the various ways in which we're measuring performance. Because often something's wrong when one looks completely out of sync with the others. And so you really want, I think, measurements that give you a more holistic view, because it might not be about that last story, but actually about a body of work that people have read over a long period of time. So
and that comes back to
one of the metrics at BuzzFeed, which is, you can imagine, is a quite metric-focused company. One of the metrics is avocados. So if a story's doing really well and it's being shared really intensively between people who really value it and are sharing it very quickly, it might have 8 avocados. And there's nothing, I can't recommend more highly having your conversations about metrics in terms of fruit or vegetables, because it just kind of undermines the importance of it a little bit. It can sound very technical, but no, I've got 9 avocados. How many avocados
That's actually really, really smart.
Is it a fruit or a vegetable?
Really, really smart. Okay, we are out of time. Thank you all for coming. Thank you all for being here.
Our last panel.
Avocados.
Avocados. That's probably...
That's actually